don't care what the politicians say. They don't need cheaper housing. They need deliverance. They don't need government. They need God. Good news here. This is CrossTalk. The doors to God's remnant remain open today. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. Meanwhile, I need to talk to you about petrodollars, petro-yuans, the failure of Washington, D.C., and the success of our money printing presses. Now, here's a scary thought. Did you know that Saudi Arabia is leaning toward preferring the Chinese yuan in a potential shift away from U.S. dollars? The Saudi leadership is pretty fed up with the American administration, and they've become quite fascinated with China. China uses the yuan. Could petro-yuans successfully compete against our petrodollars? As we continue printing trillions more dollars, they become a less valuable, more imaginary store of value. But as long as they allow us to declare that every dollar is safe because they're backed by our promise of value, our politicians and our trading partners remain pacified. I got to tell you that deep down, I think some politicians love printing money because it creates inflation. Thereby, the money in the system gets devalued, which makes the national debt less costly in real dollars because the dollars that the government spent are suddenly of lower cost. And inflation also improves the ratio of debt to gross domestic product, GDP. Since politicians get graded on the GDP along the way, it makes them look less bad, even if they did very, very badly. Unfortunately, it makes the stuff the rest of us buy more expensive. Things cost more because dollars are worth less. The less our dollars are worth, the more affordable our goods become to export to the rest of the world, and our trading partners enjoy lower dollar values because it enables them to buy more of what we're selling. Unfortunately, we still need to buy stuff here at home, and our stuff continues costing more and more and more, and that's called inflation. So, what do I really think about inflation? Inflation is a secret tax that the politicians don't have to ask Congress to raise. Raising taxes the honest way rarely gets people reelected because everyone pays taxes and nobody wants to do that. Now, don't get me wrong. We all want Congress to raise taxes on everybody richer than us. As long as somebody else is paying the freight, we love it, but that's a myth. When the government raises taxes, we all pay. Most of us pay directly. The rest of us pay indirectly through the higher costs passed on to us by the corporations, who are also charged higher taxes. Oh, corporations. The politicians love to blame corporations. That takes the heat off of the politicians who raise the taxes. And most of us blindly buy into the myth that greedy corporations should always pay more taxes. We're so silly. We're easily convinced by the politicians who raise the taxes that corporations make so much money that it is only fair they pay more taxes. And the corporations, of course, they moan and groan. Oh, we don't want to pay more taxes. That's bad for business. But deep down, I don't think they care. I don't think it matters that much to them. They don't really pay the higher taxes themselves. Think about it. They charge more for the things they make, the things they sell, and the stuff we buy. Contrary to what the politicians say, we pay everything. All the higher costs go into the prices they charge us when corporations automatically add any new expenses into their costs of goods sold. So don't be fooled. We pay their higher taxes through their higher prices. The corporations won't absorb those additional costs. I mean, why should they? Nobody can make them. Their shareholders wouldn't understand. And by the way, anybody with an IRA, a 401k, a pension, or even a measly underperforming mutual fund is a shareholder of the greedy corporations. So you should probably want them to do better, not worse. But you see, we're the kind of shareholders who have no say in the management of the corporations. We end up with less valuable investments for our retirement, in addition to the higher prices we pay for everything we buy when the economy goes badly. You see, we pay more, but we get less. Now, eventually our wages go up because of inflation. For a minute, that makes us feel good. Well, then we go buy something, and we realize that our wages didn't take us as far as we imagined. But it also artificially moved us up into a higher tax bracket. So, between the higher costs and the higher taxes, we end up with less purchasing power and more distrust in our government and the economy that just seems to get worse for average folks. But all of this is just how things work. As long as things work. What happens if we can no longer continue printing the money that greases all the wheels and gives the politicians what they need to continue buying votes through free stuff for certain classes of voters, loan forgiveness to other classes of voters, bloated budgets of pet projects to buy votes from other voters, and that's how they find ways to keep the professional politicians in office. You see, that's the rub, and that's where petrodollars come in. These so-called petrodollars didn't exist until after the West lost control of the oil fields in the Middle East. Remember, there was a time when Arab oil was under the desert, and the Arabs couldn't do anything to efficiently find it, drill for it, pump it, or ship it. It was only after British and American companies took all the risks, made all the investments, developed the oil industry in the region, and contractually shared the profits with the Arabs, who loved the wealth-building opportunities they had negotiated, that the Arab oil sheiks suddenly recognized, hey, this is a good thing. They're getting all of this liquid gold out of our desert sands. The agreements provided lucrative profits for the Arabs, for the oil companies, and let's not forget, it created cheap gas and oil for the world. When I was a teenager, my job was working at a service station. They weren't called gas stations, even though we sold gas for 32.9 cents a gallon. I worked at what was identified as a service station because when you drove over the little rubber hose in the driveway, a bell rang. That was when I ran out to your car, I washed your windshield, I checked your oil, I put air in your tires if they were low, and while I was serving you, I filled up your entire gas tank for about $5. Of course, you got the same service even if you only got $1 worth of gas if you and your buddies were splitting that dollar, because sometimes it was tough to come up with $1. But if you only got $1 worth of gas and you wanted our service, I gave it to you. Now, not long thereafter, OPEC transformed into the monster that it is today. The oil fields in those nations that we had developed earlier were nationalized. This nationalization happened when the rich oil sheiks who made the deals and were running their backwards countries decided to kick out the original British and American investors so they could take over all their assets in the name of the public good. But really, they primarily just enriched themselves as they built their own little kingdoms while most of the poor people just stayed poor. And as their wealth and power grew, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC, began flexing their muscles through oil embargoes and other efforts that made sure that our 32-cent a gallon gas was a thing of distant memories. Some Americans would enjoy affordable gasoline again, but that is unlikely when we are in a vice between OPEC and the politicians who like high-priced gasoline. You see, expensive gas fits the political narrative that gas engines are bad, and so are the people who drive them with no care for the earth. Now, some in Washington and many of the wealthy left-wing political supporters want to end the era of gasoline automobiles. They don't tell us how much energy is used to make the batteries for electric cars. They don't tell us the cost to replace those batteries or the environmental damage done disposing of those batteries. They don't tell us how many jobs are at stake or how our goods will be delivered across the nation when they've criminalized the use of fossil fuels. They don't tell us how much our stuff will cost us when manufacturers are forced to pay new carbon taxes. And they don't tell us how it will feel when we are forced to be looking over our shoulders or paying our own carbon penalties, carbon fees, and carbon fines if our personal so-called carbon footprints don't pass muster under the watchful eyes of the carbon Nazis doing the dirty work of the recently appointed carbon czars right here in America. Our fearless leaders and Hollywood activist gurus are currently pacified by simply trying to guilt us out of our gas hogs. But their guilt doesn't ground many of their private jets. Frankly, I don't care what they drive or what they fly. It's supposed to be one beautiful aspect of living in a free country. If someone can afford to drive a Motor City muscle car, let them. If they prefer to drive a hybrid, a plug-in, a private Gulfstream jet, or if they want to ride a unicycle to work, let them. Just don't legislate my freedom according to your preferences. And I wish that our leaders would spend a little more time addressing our immediate problems, like the flood of fentanyl killing 150 Americans every day as it flows through our southern border. Equally disturbing, these new designer drug addictions have fueled an explosion of homelessness and violence across America. Recently, my wife and I were in Chicago to visit a relative. We went right to downtown Chicago for a dinner, and we were enjoying a stroll down the Miracle Mile. And suddenly, a homeless man arbitrarily walked up to two ladies near us on the sidewalk and violently hauled off and punched her in the face as he just walked on, just grumbling to himself. He was likely one of the countless addicts who have lost their minds to these drugs, but not their ability to hurt innocent people. Do you realize that there are more than 500,000 homeless people now roaming our streets? Drugs have destroyed their lives. I don't care what the politicians say, they're wrong. They don't need cheaper housing. They need deliverance. They don't need government. They need God. Most of these people can't socialize. The drugs have caused such a disconnect in their brain. They prefer to be in a little pot of a tent. There's a growing plague, and it's covering our land, and it's not due to a lack of low-income housing. It's due to the flood of illegal drugs pouring in from Mexico that have been sourced from China. Addiction has created Hoovervilles of homeless addicts living in tents and shantytowns in too many cities to name, but no surprise, half of them, more than 250,000, are in California and New York. Yeah, they certainly know how to outlaw gasoline automobiles, but they sure don't seem able to fix real-world problems that are obviously, absolutely out of control. Instead of solving our nation's immediate problems, too many leaders and influencers prefer to talk about gaseous cows and electric cars while they focus on a future generation instead of facing the catastrophes that will likely be experienced by today's Americans because of short-sighted leadership and flawed governance. So, how did we get here? How did we get here? What happened to our economy? When the U.S. dollar became disconnected from the original underlying asset of gold, which gave it value, things changed. Make no mistake, this is a relatively recent event in American history, and it had an unmistakable cause and effect. In the 1970s, our politicians had to find a way to pay for the enormously expensive, unpopular war in Vietnam. America also faced a growing international trade problem. Our nation had gone from having trade surpluses to trade deficits. That just meant that America bought more stuff produced by other nations than we made here at home and exported to those other nations. We bought more than we sold. That meant we had to pay for those things. But you see, those were the facts that put enormous pressure on the U.S. dollar. Back then, when we were still forced to have a required amount of gold on hand for every dollar we printed, the dollar was truly worth what it was valued in gold. But something terrible happened to our financial picture. We suddenly needed much more money than we had gold. It would sort of be like your personal family budget getting so far out of whack that you saw no end to the panic in sight. You simply had bought so much more than you could afford that it led to your financial failure. The difference? Well, the difference was that you and your family, you had no magical powers. Our government made economic magic happen. It was an unconscionable act of ruthless genius. This became one more thing for which we could thank President Richard Nixon. In addition to Watergate, opening trade relations with China, and being impeached, Nixon also took America off of the gold standard. Now, I don't remember why, but I voted for Nixon. When we were suddenly allowed to begin printing dollars backed by nothing, our brilliant politicians solved the war problem, the trade problem, and all they had to do was end the gold standard in one fast step toward solving a temporary financial problem and replacing it with an economic time bomb. I certainly didn't understand all of it then, but I know what happened now, and I see it happening again. We cranked up the presses, and this was how our government has been solving problems ever since. When they need more money, instead of buying more gold to back up our dollars, they buy more paper and turn on the money-making machines. They don't need gold, they don't need silver, they don't need hard assets or commodities of any kind to back the dollar. They just need enough other suckers to agree that the naked emperor's new suit is gorgeous. And that brings us back to Saudi Arabia. In the mid-1970s, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. climbed back into bed together so that we could help them with their oil field projects. And the concept of petrodollars was invented. Now, as discoveries of oil and gas were made outside of the Middle East later in that decade, petrodollars began being spread all around the world as we funded our energy purchases with paper dollars backed by the world's hope and our promise. And it has worked like magic ever since. The U.S. dollar became the dominant form of currency around the world. It is what we now call the international reserve currency. It's an important term. I'm sure you're going to be hearing a lot about it. And you see, that means that our dollars are enjoyed by central banks around the globe. It also means that every nation wants our currency. They love our dollars. They may hate our politics, our freedoms, and our bluster, but they love our money. But for how long? You see, recently, some economists and geopolitical observers are beginning to worry about the waning global love affair with the American dollar. They now wonder if and for how long our dollars can retain the status of being, bingo, the international reserve currency. Guess who would prefer to see their currency replace ours as a widely accepted form of international trade currency? If you assumed it might be our enemies, you'd be correct. This should cause us to wonder just how serious are our nation's financial problems. Now, our politicians want us to focus on things that nobody can blame them for breaking. I think that's why climate change issues are the darling of D.C. Think about it. In theory, since coal has been powering our energy needs, oil has been running our vehicles, and our man-made climate change has been ruining the earth almost as long as our cows have been emitting ozone-destroying flatulence, nobody can honestly blame today's government for yesterday's bad decisions. Well, some of our leaders have held elected offices for many decades. It's their profession. It's what they do. They just keep running from one office to another and continue getting promoted beyond their capabilities because they got friends in the right places and they know who to please to stay in power. But intellectual honesty demands that we realize nobody could truly pin our environmental problems on the current administration or the one in charge at the moment when everything falls apart. You see, those guys can't be blamed for breaking the earth. Besides, greenhouse gas emissions won't wipe anybody out for a few decades, maybe centuries, who knows. Global warming is therefore a valuable DC distraction to avoid facing something as potentially financially devastating as our own economic collapse. And the failure of our economy would be blamed on whoever was holding the hot potato when the music stopped. Is the music stopping? You hear that silence? The recent courtships and engagements between China and Russia, alongside Saudi Arabia and Iran, should be a wake-up call to the woke crowd in our society. Imagine the economic devastation we'd experience if America lost our reserve currency status and we were suddenly forced to shut down our money printing machines. How could we continue to run multi-trillion-dollar deficits if we had no more ability to perpetually fabricate trillions of dollars out of worthless paper? Such a prospect would lead to the end of a stable American economy. Could the financial marriage of our greatest enemies actually come to pass? Real question, real serious issue. The answer is yes. In fact, that is what has just been proposed and agreed to by China and Russia. Our most dangerous and most inhumane adversaries are entering into new currency contracts, economic engagements, trade agreements, and energy deals. The obvious future outcome for them is to link the powerful new economic engines of China to the economic machines of Russia in a combination that would create a formidable replacement to compete with the U.S. dollar as the, remember, international reserve currency. Vladimir Putin spelled it out with unmistakable clarity. He named the Chinese yuan as Russia's favored currency in which to conduct trade. Did you know that a new pipeline is going to be built from Russia all the way to China? It's a big deal, and it's a big pipeline planned to deliver 50 billion cubic feet of natural gas per year. And isn't it interesting that it is now China who's buying much of Russia's oil, while Russia has been loading up on gold in the face of Western sanctions. Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine alienated Russia from the West, but it has drawn Russia closer to the Far East. Some have called this recent move the dusk of the petrodollar and the dawn of the petro-yuan. Could it happen? Some believe it's possible. Now, a caveat does exist. Perhaps this disaster could be delayed. We must remember that China does hold a lot of U.S. debt, and, well, our trading partners do want us to continue buying the stuff they sell, and they still want to buy the stuff that we sell. But if the long-term goal of our communist competitors is dominance, they might be willing to trade some financial loss and temporary inconvenience in exchange for the certain increase in their global power base as they weaken ours simultaneously. I believe this is all part of the reason our enemies are making dangerous new deals while our eyes follow the next shiny environmental or social object lesson floated by our professional politicians. After all, it's much easier for our leaders to talk about impossible tasks such as, fixing the polar ice cap. The elected officials of America, well, they can't really fix that. So nobody will blame them for not being able to do the impossible. And yet they seem to sound so serious and concerned when they're trying. On the other side of the problem spectrum, it's also easier and safer for them to address simple, absolutely inconsequential problems, such as the dislikes of a few sexually confused transgenders. They might be able to make them a little bit less unhappy, but they don't seem up to the task of actually managing a real national threat, such as is posed by the largest nation in the world, Russia, joining the economic forces with the most populated nation in the world, China. Think about it. The economic chaos that could be launched through a bromance between these two communist giants doesn't rise to the level of interest that our current administration seems to be able to muster. Another foreboding development is the unexpected courtship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both of these Muslim nations are oil-producing countries, and both countries have reason to exploit their synergies at our expense. And guess who the matchmaker was in arranging this surprising relationship? If you guessed China, you'd be correct. China formally brokered the Saudi-Iran agreement. This also amplified how influential China has become in the Middle East. My friends, there may be a new sheriff coming to town, and English isn't his first language. If Iran can overcome the sanctions they have faced by working with Saudi Arabia and China, all of our enemies would be empowered to easily join economic forces to bring us down. They wouldn't need bombs, guns, or terrorists. All they would need is to reach an agreement among themselves to prop up their favorite competing currency against our U.S. dollar for the premier spot as the chosen form of exchange for oil, the international reserve currency, which is currently the petrodollar. What if it was the petro-yuan? And since Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia all produce oil and nobody needs more than China at the moment, this could be a match made in hell. They could render our most important economic weapon useless. The petrodollar could become a distant memory. The petro-yuan could eventually rival a weakened U.S. dollar, revealing the nakedness of the American economy with an emperor who had been disrobed for the entire world to see. If our communist enemies in China and Russia have their way, the creditworthiness of the American dollar, the U.S. economy, and the American dream could be reduced to a shambles without ever having a shooting war. A simple agreement between our enemies and the oil-producing nations of the world, who are not our friends anyway, could change everything without ever firing a shot or lobbing a missile in our direction.